This morning I'm going to be reading to you The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This book is just a classic, so we're going to do the first two chapters today. All right, here we go. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty. He himself was very old, with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head. And they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending that he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they said good night to the professor and had gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake," said Peter, who was the oldest. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off of it," said Edmund, who was tired of pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that," Edmund said. "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm going to go to bed? Go to bed yourself," Edmund snapped. Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes walk. It's about a 10-minute walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's the noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find a place you like." "Did you see those mountains as we came along, and the woods? There might be eagles, there might be stags, there'll be hawks for sure," Peter said. "And badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when next morning came, there was a steady rain falling so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could neither see the mountains, the woods, nor the stream in the garden. "Oh, of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor, and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room with 2 windows looking in one direction and 2 in the other. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventure began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried only led to spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures that they had found a suit, and they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green and a harp in the corner. And then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out to the balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other, that were lined with books. Most of them were very old books, and some of them bigger than the Bible in a church. And shortly after they looked into a room that was quite empty except for a long, big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room except for a dead blue bottle on a windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she almost felt sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing that Lucy liked so much as the smell and the feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open. Of course, because she knew it was very foolish to shut oneself in a wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, and then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must simply be an enormous wardrobe, Lucy thought. Going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her, then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder, is that more mothballs?" she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor in the wardrobe, she felt something soft, powdery, and extremely cold. "Well, this is quite queer," she said, when she went a step further or 2. The next moment, she found that she was rubbing her face and hands. The next moment, she found that what she was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer the soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it's just like the branches of a tree," she exclaimed. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not only a few inches away from the back of the wardrobe, to where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but it was a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. It seemed to be daylight there. "I can always get back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow, and through the wood towards the other light. In 10 minutes she reached it and found that it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of the wood and wondering what to do next, she heard the pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after, a very strange person stepped out from among the tree into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist up, he looked like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. and instead of feet, he had goat hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so that it was to keep from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella, and in the other he carried several brown parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as though he had gone Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me," explained the fawn. Okay, so that was chapter 1. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we'll read chapter 2. Okay. Chapter 2. "Good evening," said Lucy. But the fawn was so busy picking up his parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening, said the fawn. "Excuse me, I don't mean to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are the daughter of Eve?" "My name is Lucy," she said, not quite understanding him. "But you are, forgive me, you are what they call a girl?" asked the fawn. "Well, of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "You are in fact human?" he asked her. "Of course I'm human," said Lucy, and still a little puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. "How stupid of me. But I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before, and I'm delighted. That is to say," and then it stopped as if it had been going to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. "Oh, delighted, it went on. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "Oh, I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "And may I ask, oh, Lucy, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how have you come into Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "Well, this is the land of Narnia," said the fawn. "We are where we are now, all that lies between the lamp-post and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea." "And you have come from the wild woods of the west?" he asked. I got through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," Mr. Tumnus, in a rather melancholy voice, said, "if only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know about all those strange countries. It is too late now, though," Mr. Fawn said. "But they aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only just back there, at least. I'm not sure. It is summer there." "Meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it is winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long, and we shall both catch a cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the land of Spare Oam, where eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe. How would it be if you came and had tea with me?" "Oh, I thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back." "Oh, it's only just around the corner," said Mr. Fawn, "and there'll be a roaring fire and toast and sardines and even cake." "Well, that's very kind of you," said Lucy, "but I shan't be staying so long." "Well, if you will take my arm, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us, and it's that way. Now, off we go," said the fawn. And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood, arm in arm with the strange creature, as if they had known one another all of their lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough, and there were rocks all about, and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of a very small valley, Tumnus turned slowly aside as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. And Mr. Tumnus stopped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire and a neat little pair of tongs and lit the lamp. "Now, we shan't be long," he said, and immediately put the kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone and a carpet on the floor and 2 little chairs, and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire. And above was a picture of an old faun with a gray beard. In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Tumnus' bedroom. And on the wall there was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silas, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend, and there was also a book called Is Man a Myth? "Now, daughter of Eve," said the faun. And really, it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice large brown egg lightly boiled for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and a large sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the faun began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of forest life. He told her about the midnight dances and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fauns, about long hunting parties after the milk-white stag who could give you wishes if you caught them, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer when the woods were green, and then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to the jollification for weeks on end. "Not that it isn't always winter now," he added gloomily. Then, to cheer himself out, he took out a case on the dresser and a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw, and he began to play. And the tune made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune really, but I must go home. I'm really meant to stay only a few minutes." "Oh, it's no good now, you know," said the faun, putting down his flute and shaking his head at her sorrowfully. "No good?" Lucy said, jumping up. "What do you mean? I've got to get home at once. The others will be wondering what happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" And she asked this, for the faun's brown eyes were filled with big tears, and then the big tears began trickling down his cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of his nose, and at last he covered his face with his hands and began to howl. Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy in great distress. Don't cry. What is the matter? Aren't you well? Tell me what is wrong." But the faun continued sobbing, as if his heart would break, and even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be of use anymore. "Do stop. What is the matter?" Lucy asked him. Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. "I'm crying because I am such a bad faun." "I don't think you're a bad faun at all," said Lucy. "I think you're a very good faun, the nicest faun that I've ever met." Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between sobs. "I'm a bad faun, and I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the very beginning of time. But what have you done? Asked Lucy. My old father now, said Mr. Tumnus. That's his picture over the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this. A thing like what? Asked Lucy. Like what I've done. Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch. The White Witch? She asked. Who is she? Why, it is she that has got all of Narnia under her thumb. It's she that makes it winter. Always winter and never Christmas. Think of that, said the fawn. How awful, said Lucy, but how does she but what does she pay you for? Oh, that's the worst of it, said Mr. Tumnus, with a deep groan. I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly and invite her to my home in the cave, all for the sake of lulling it to sleep and then handing it over to the White Witch? No, said Lucy, I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort. Oh, but I have, said the fawn. Well, said Lucy rather slowly. Well, that was pretty bad. But you're sorry for it, and that I'm sure you'll never do it again. Daughter of Eve, don't you understand, said the fawn. It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now, this very moment. What do you mean? Cried Lucy, turning very white. You are the child, said Mr. Tumnus. I had orders from the White Witch that if ever I saw son of Eve or daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first that I've ever met, and I've pretended to be your friend, and I've asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait until you were asleep and then go and tell her. Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't. And if I don't, he said, he began crying, she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns swan off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hoofs and turn them into horrid solid hoofs, like that of a wretched horse's. And if she is extra and specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall be only a statue of a fawn in her horrible house, until the 4 thrones at the castle are filled. And goodness knows what will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all. Oh, I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, but please, you need to let me go home. Oh, of course I will, said the fawn. Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your way back to the spare room and wardrobe. Oh, I'm sure that I can, said Lucy. We must go quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is full of her spies, and even some of the trees are on her side. They both got up and left their tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put his umbrella up around Lucy and gave her his arm. And they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the cave. They stole along as quickly as they could without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the dark places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? He asked. Lucy looked very hard between the trees and could see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off as quick as you can. And can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? He asked her. Why, of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand. And I do hope that you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, he said. Perhaps I might keep this handkerchief? Oh, rather, said Lucy. and then ran towards a far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs would carry. And presently, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt coats. Instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden boards. And all at once, she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe and into the same empty room which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe tightly behind her, and looking around, panting for breath, it was still raining, and she could hear the voices of the others in the passage. "I'm here," she shouted. "I'm here. Come back. I'm all right," she shouted to her brothers and sisters. Okay. That was chapter 2 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We'll probably do 3 and 4 another day. Thank you.